Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Marriage and Kinship. Today, we are switching gears and we are going to talk about being single. Previously, we have talked about ideologies of romantic love as like being a story about your life and finding your romantic love partner as being the necessary happy ending. So, how can you fill your life's story without a partner? What does it mean to be single? Where marriage is associated with households, being single could mean being derelict in your duty to your family. You are not getting married and producing the next generation. Perhaps even worse, where marriage is associated with romantic love, singleness can be understood as a sign of a flawed and unlovable character, that you're just basically a person who is broken. Today, we're going to talk about specifically speed dating and how people understand singleness within this context. So, speed dating, I hope you know what that is. I know that in the past, various clubs at NU have organized speed dating events. I've seen advertising for speed dating events in Kazakhstan. Basically, you have, in a heterosexual context, you have an equal number of men and women, and everybody is paired up, and you have a certain brief number of minutes to talk, maybe 5, 10 max. And then at the end of that period of time, everybody rotates and talks to the next person for 10 minutes and so on. So how do you get to know someone quickly? How do you learn enough about somebody in 5 to 10 minutes so that you know you maybe want to see more of them, or that you definitely don't? More specifically, what kinds of questions do you ask to quickly determine if you want to get to know someone better? What is the absolute most important information that you have to get out of this conversation? More specifically, we have data from 30 dates, each lasting between 3 and 8 minutes, that were recorded by the participants themselves at a real speed dating event in the United Kingdom. Participants were aged 30 to 45. Because the organization of the event meant women remained seated while men rotated between them, women participants were asked to operate the recording device. So there was a recording device at each table. Only women who agreed at the start of the event to participate in the research operated devices, and only those dates in which men participants also gave their consent were recorded. Then the recorded data were transcribed according to Jefferson's system for conversation analysis. This is a technique that looks at the details of how conversation happens, how you take turns, when you pause, when certain conversational topics are introduced, in order to understand something about society. Like other institutional materials, these short dating encounters between previously unacquainted parties are ideally suited to conversation analytics study because each date is self-contextualizing. The analyst, like the participants, knows just what each party chooses to reveal to the other. So it's basically, if you are the person analyzing this data, like you are on this speed date with this people. All you have is their conversation, and all you know is what they wanted to know from each other and how each person responded and how the conversation proceeded. If you're not used to looking at linguistic data, this is possibly a weird article for you, but I hope everybody who took Introduction to Linguistic Anthropology in the past is prepared for this. So speed daters are obviously single. And in this case, because we have people from 30 to 45, they're single at relatively advanced ages. Being single at 30 isn't such a big deal, but 45, you have to wonder what has happened. So there may be several reasons. One would be divorce. A second, much more sad, would be widowhood, where your spouse dies. And then perhaps you have people who have never been married. Amongst the people who have never been married, we can kind of split them into two different types. So the first have minimal romantic history. They haven't dated anyone very much, or maybe they've dated a bunch of people, but nothing has really lasted. They don't really have past relationships that they can talk about. Then you have people who have never been married, but who nonetheless have significant romantic history, who've had long-term relationships lasting a year, 2 years longer, who've experienced living with romantic partners, who might even have children from those relationships. And the fact that they've never been married is maybe sometimes more of a legal distinction than a social distinction. So, how do speed daters account for their singleness in conversation? How do you explain to the other person that you're with why you are single? And which kinds of singleness are the most difficult to explain? In addition to having to explain why you're single, people who are at a speed dating event also generally have to explain why they have chosen to come to a speed dating event specifically, as opposed to something more natural like going to a bar or meeting someone through friends or even online dating. Why would you do speed dating? It's very artificial and structured and maybe kind of weird. So the two people who are having this conversation have to disclose their histories. Again, we have these two questions: why are you here at a speed dating event, and why are you single? Speed daters may volunteer this information freely, or they may be prompted by their conversation partner to address these questions. It's quite interesting because you would think that the person asking the questions maybe wouldn't be concerned about it because both people are at the speed dating event. And so presumably they're both single and they've both chosen speed dating. And you would think that the other person probably has a good reason, but no, actually no. Everybody is quite judgmental of each other. So we have phrases in the transcripts like, with my kids at home, where do you go to meet someone? You can't go to bars, you can't go to parties, you can't do the things a younger person might do if you have kids, so you go to a specific event like speed dating. We have, I've been on my own for a couple of years, I've been married. Okay, so this is a person who's probably divorced, right? But who has been divorced for a couple of years and maybe doesn't quite know what to do afterwards. And then we have this very blatant question, right? So what's your history then? Relationship history. However, even though everybody asks these questions, they are aware that it's a sensitive question. It's something that's on people's mind, but not the first thing they ask about it. But they nonetheless, like in every conversation, do make sure to ask or get the answers to these two questions. This is something that you've really got to know. Why is this person single? And why are they here? But it's a delicate question, right? People are touchy about it. You know, you can't just ask people about their divorce or, like, God forbid, if they're widowed, like, then you have to ask them about, like, their dead husband or wife. It's a delicate question, right? So there are ways to kind of mitigate it. So we have this one example. Have you got children as well? Or trailing or, right, is really important. So we can, if we look at this question in detail, we can see how it's actually very carefully designed to be delicate and to manage the other person's feelings. So, for example, saying as well says, I have children too. So if you have kids, that's fine. We both have kids. We understand what it's like. It's safe to answer this question. And the trailing or also leaves open other possibilities. Maybe you don't have kids, but that's fine too. It's okay. Whichever you answer, it's fine. Just please tell me. So, after looking at all of this data, what is the most difficult kind of singleness to explain? For the British speed daters studied by Stokoe, the people who had the hardest time explaining themselves were people who had never been married at all, or who had never had a marriage-like long-term relationship. It was the people with minimal romantic history. For these speed daters, it's understandable if you've been in a relationship and it didn't work out. You know, life is like that. You try your best, it doesn't always work. But if you haven't been in a relationship, people start to wonder, like, what's up? So in one conversation, Stokoe notes that by mentioning a prior committed relationship, people can demonstrate to their conversation partners that they are a person who is capable of having that kind of a relationship and who desires to have that kind of a relationship, who knows what it's all about, who has realistic expectations. By contrast, if you have no experience of a really long relationship, then you have to come up with a reason why it's not about how you are a terrible person. So Stokoe notes that a lot of the participants in these conversations used travel to explain a minimal relationship history, because travel is positive, right? Somebody who can travel a lot probably has money, probably has an interesting job. Stokoe mentions that they might seem worldly, sophisticated, or experienced. And the thing is that when you're traveling a lot for a good reason, of course you can't date anybody for a really long time. That's just really hard. So it's a legitimate reason to be single. So if you have this kind of legitimate reason, or you have a reason that might make you seem really good and desirable in other ways, then you can avoid seeming flawed and unlovable. So we have Stokoe examining the use of another man's phrase that he never had the right relationship at the right time, which is a variant of, never being in the right place at the right time. So this implies that he's single just because, it just didn't happen. It was circumstances. It's not him. It's definitely not him. Men have more to account for than women do. And I'd like you to talk about the reason that Stokoe gives and what you think of that in the comments. Finally, let's talk about the images of family that are implied by the information that people think they need to know. Stokoe tells us that relationship history questions were often formulated in terms of recipients' current or prior marital and parental status. And the way that they asked these questions implied that these two things kind of naturally go together. So questions about marriage were followed with questions about children and vice versa. Or questions about marriage might prompt people to answer both questions as they're implicit. So these question-answer pairs configure and sustain a particular heteronormative notion of the family as desirable, as the goal of speed dating. Finally, it turns out that having baggage is actually good. We think of past relationship baggage as stuff that maybe negatively affects future relationships, but here it's interpreted as a sign of much needed experience. Thank you for listening, and I'll catch you next time.